Hello, my name is Claude Jr. Harwood, and I was born in 1925, June the 12th, in Larned, Kansas. I've lived in Larned till I graduated from high school, and my first occupation after high school was in the United States Army. My father had a plumbing business in Larned. He was he and a World War I veteran purchased two Model T cars and turned them into plumbing trucks, and they had a plumbing business throughout most of the Depression that was really pretty well give us a good time during the Depression.
Talk to us about growing up in that town. What was the population?
Population of the town was about 3,500, and the schools were probably most of my classes were between 20, 25, or 30, and we had a number of African American students in the classes. We were all very friendly, got along well. We played some sports. I was never very good at it, but I always wanted to be a baseball player, but I just didn't have the skills to really be a good one. But I enjoyed the game and I enjoyed the sports and really enjoyed school at that time.
Can you tell us about, you mentioned the Depression. It didn't affect your family too much. What were some of the things you saw in the community that made you realize there's a depression going on?
Really not very much in our little town. Just about everybody that wanted to work could find some kind of a job. We had several businesses that were going. And actually the Depression, I thought, in our little town wasn't all that bad.
When you were, a teenager and you and your buddies would get together, what did you all do for fun?
Oh, we went to the movies a lot. You could go to the movies on Saturday afternoon for a nickel, buy a nickel's worth of popcorn, and they were always Western movies. We enjoyed Western movies. Some of the kids, like I say, were sports, and they played baseball. I never was that good at it, but we had a game we called Work Up. I guess it was four or five of us would have kind of a baseball game. We'd have a pitcher and a catcher and a batter and a fielder, and we tried to play baseball.
Was there any incidents where you got involved with some mischief, maybe around Halloween?
Not really. A lot of the kids did. Oh, they painted windows with soap. That was one of the things they did. And they tore up some of the benches around town and a few things like that. But it was never bad, and I really never got into much of that.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about your friend group growing up? Who did you run around with?
Well, in my neighborhood, there was Bill and Paul Moore. Bill was a little bit older than me, and Paul was a little bit younger. There was Frances Bell, and she was a little bit older than me. And Robert Baker, he lived down the street. And we played cowboys and Indians, and we had fun with a rubber tire. We'd roll rubber tires for make believe they were automobiles racing, and we just had some games. Most of them we just made up ourselves.
Can you give us an idea of what your worldview was like before you entered the service? How far had you traveled outside of that town?
The farthest I'd been was to St. Louis and to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and that was as far as I'd gone either way. And I wasn't all that interested in the world. We had radios, of course, and we heard a newscast 2 or 3 times a day, and we could hear some of the things that were going on in Europe. The war was kind of starting, and also in China, where they were having a war. But it didn't really affect us all that much because we were so far away.
And can you tell us about how you heard? Could you please tell us how you heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Yes, that was on a Sunday afternoon. And some friends, a friend of mine had been out in the country. We were target practicing. I think there was an old watermelon field, and we would shoot 22 caliber rifle bullets into those watermelons and watch them explode. And when we got home, the first thing on the radio was the attack on Pearl Harbor, and that was about all we knew, that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And we were, of course, upset about it and felt that it was going to draw us into the war, but there wasn't anything we could do about it. But that was the main thing that happened on that day. And then, of course, the next day, we were in school, and they had an assembly, and they had a radio there, and we heard President Roosevelt speech about going into the war against Japan, and how that was the day that would live in infamy.
What was it like for you personally? You know, did you feel like your life was about to change?
I didn't really, because I was young enough. I didn't think I had to worry about going to the war. But the war kept dragging on, and so I did find out that I was getting old enough that I would be in the war.
Can you tell us a little bit about the surge of patriotism right after Pearl Harbor?
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the things you noticed people in the community doing to help with the war effort?
Well, one of the biggest things was some of the younger people that were in their late teens enlisted in the Army. We had one man that lived down the street from me, and he was in the Philippines, and he was involved with the Death March from Bataan, and he was in Japan all during the war, or in Japanese prison during the war. And that was a terrible thing, because we could hear about it a little bit, but we didn't get much word from him. There was an air base being built in Great Bend, Kansas, and a lot of the people in our town were employed building that air base. They would go over there and work on weekends, and when they weren't employed, they would be building barracks and laying concrete runways for the big airplanes that were going to be stationed there. And so the town was pretty much involved in the effort. My father especially was involved because he couldn't get young people to work for him much during the war, and he had to take on an awful lot of responsibility and do a lot of the work that ordinarily he would have hired somebody to do. But we made it through. We had always had enough to eat, and we had pretty good income during the war.
Could you please take us through how you ended up in the U.S. Army?
Okay. I graduated from high school in 1943, and I was going to go to college, and I made arrangements to go to the summer school in Kansas State University, or it was called Kansas State College at that time. But I hadn't much more than got enrolled till I got notice that I was selected by Selective Service to serve in the United States Army or Air Force or Navy. So when I was taken to the local physician there for my physical examination to get in the military service, I was taken back home to Larned, placed on a train with some of my other friends, and we went to Fort Leavenworth, where I was inducted into the United States Army. That was probably October of 1943, and I was in Fort Leavenworth for probably 6 weeks. And then we were selected to go to Fort Benning, Georgia. And I was enlisted in the Army, the infantry, in Fort Benning. We had our basic training at Fort Benning, and then we were transferred to Camp Livingston, Louisiana for maneuvers. And we did a lot of simulated battle training in Fort Benning. We learned to fire different weapons for target practice. I could hear my ears ringing for several hours after we went to target practice with those high-powered rifles. And we camped out a lot. We were there until I think probably about September. And I had a furlough to go home to Larned for about 7-day furlough before I went overseas. When I came back, we were shipped on a troop train to Camp Shanks, New York. And from Camp Shanks, we boarded a ocean liner. It was called a RSM Mauritania. It was one of Cunard Liner's peacetime ocean liners that carried traffic across the Atlantic Ocean between the United States and Europe. On the trip to England, we had a drill. I don't know whether it was a drill or an actual attack. The ship had to change course every 18 minutes because it took the submarines that long to make a sighting on a ship to send a torpedo. And one day we were told to go to the inside of the ship, off of the decks. You could hear the sirens going off. And while we were down there, we heard several explosions. There were gunfire and also depth charges. I don't know whether that was a drill or whether it was an actual attack, but at least we survived. And pretty much the rest of the trip to Europe was uneventful. We landed at Southampton in England, went to a army camp there, and were outfitted for trips to Europe. That was after the war. That was after D-Day, the invasion of Europe. And okay, well, we were in Europe, an army camp at Southampton. After we were there a few weeks, we didn't get to meet very many of the English people. They did have a PX there, and the people that operated it were English, and their accent, and they talked so fast it was difficult to understand them. But anyway, we bought a few things from the PX there. Then we went to Southampton on a train, and when we got down there, we boarded what was called a Channel ferry. It was in peacetime, a ferry boat between England and France. And while we were on this trip out in the English Channel, they served us tea. That was an English custom, I guess, for the troops to have tea in the middle of the afternoon. I thought that was kind of a quaint custom in the middle of a war to be having tea in the middle of the afternoon. Anyway, when we got to France, we anchored out off of Omaha Beach, and they threw cargo nets over the side of the ship. And we had a big, heavy backpack with all our equipment and blankets and everything, clothes in it. And we were to climb down that cargo net and onto a landing ship. It was called a landing ship personnel. As we pulled away from the Channel ferry, we motored out into the where the Omaha Beach was, and they had built a long pier. I think it was made out of floating concrete some way. I don't know just how they did it. But we pulled up to that, and then we got on the pier, and then we walked up on the pier to the beach itself. And you could still tell it was a wartime situation. The tank traps that were in the water were still there. There was a little bit of the World War II invasion debris, and you could see that it was a kind of a deadly place. We were kind of down where the Germans could shoot right onto the Omaha Beach area with their machine guns and cannons and mortars and everything like that. We went up a trail to the top of the cliffs above Omaha Beach, and there was a big concrete bunker up there that had slits for them to fire through down at the beach. And we saw that. It must have been a deadly situation at that time. Anyway, while we were there, it was all quiet. There wasn't any war. It had moved on into the interior of Europe. We went to what was called a replacement depot. It was a kind of a village made out of tents, and we were kept in the tents while we were there, and we were issued combat material, uniforms. We had helmets, rifles, ammunition, and then we were loaded onto trucks, and we were motored into Belgium. And that day was the last day that the Germans had in Aachen. They surrendered that particular day. So when we got into Aachen, we were unloaded, and we were moved into German buildings and things that survived the attack. I was assigned to the Company I of the 1st Infantry 26th Regiment, and their headquarters were under kind of in a basement-like structure on the front lines of the war. And I was taken down into this place with some of my other replacements, and I was so clumsy. They had a number 9 can there that used as a urinal, and also I was just so clumsy I kicked that thing over, and of course the poor lieutenant, he was just flabbergasted that I would do something like that. And after he settled down, why then we were given our places. My first night was on the front line. They took my rifle away and gave me what was called a Browning automatic rifle. It was a heavy machine gun, but it could be fired from the shoulder. It wasn't as big as the regular based machine guns. And after dark, we had to go out about a 50 or 60 foot path to the first foxhole that was right on the very front lines. And there was firing going on. You could hear it in the distance out there. Well, after dark, because if you went in the daytime, they would see you and they would open up fire. So after dark, I went out that walkway and relieved the soldier that had been out there for the previous 24 hours. I went down into the foxhole, which is probably a good 6 feet deep and fairly roomy, and he got out and went back in for his time out there. Well, when I was out there, the Germans fired tracer ammunition up into the air, into the sky, at about a 45-degree angle. And it was to lure us up to look at that. And then they had just plain ammunition that didn't have any tracers in it, that was just raking along the ground, just about 18 inches above the ground. So if we'd have went up there, well, I knew enough to not do that. I didn't want to expose myself. Anyway, after all that kind of quieted down, why the evening went on pretty good. And this is kind of the story the kids like me to tell. I heard something creeping up through the bushes outside of the foxhole. And I, at the time, thought, well, maybe that's German soldiers coming up. So I had that machine gun or that automatic rifle ready. And I was just on the burst of opening it if anybody showed up to fire at them. Well, to my surprise and relief, a great big old German or Belgian domestic rabbit hopped out of the bushes. And I didn't have to shoot it, and that poor rabbit never did realize how close he came to being shredded by that machine gun fire. Anyway, the kids all kind of chuckle at that. The rest of the night went on pretty good. There wasn't anything happened. As dawn approached, I had some sea ration cans for breakfast that I brought with me out. And the day went along pretty good. And then all of a sudden there was a couple of mortar shells exploded just very close to my foxhole. And the big chunks of dirt rained down into the hole, and the hole just shook for a little bit. But the mortar shell missed me, and I wasn't injured at all. So the day went along pretty good like that. And then that evening, when the person came to relieve me, then I crept out of the foxhole and back into the headquarters of the company. So that was my first experience of combat on the front lines in Germany. The town had been surrendered then, and they occupied Aachen, and that was the first German town that was occupied by the Americans.
What was going on in your head? I mean, you were 19 years old, you were on the front lines, far away from Kansas.
Yeah.
What were you thinking, sir?
Well, I thought, it was a dangerous place. I could maybe not survive. I didn't know. But self-preservation kind of took place, and I thought I would just rely on my training back in Fort Benning and Camp Livingston, stay as low as I could to the ground and try to ride it out. Mm-hmm.
And that incident with the German tracers, so they were firing the machine gun tracers higher than the actual bullets.
Yeah, they just thought it would be like the 4th of July. We'd raise up to look at it, and when the bullets came across on the ground, then we would be casualties. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you tell me, when you first got introduced to the men of the company, these are combat veterans. They were there, 1st Division, as you know, fought in Africa, Sicily, D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
What did some of the older veterans tell you about combat? Did they give you advice, or?
Yes, they did. I was assigned to a platoon, and our platoon sergeant was a man named Bob Horvath. He was from St. Louis, and he was a very friendly fellow, and he was very helpful in initiating me to combat. He said, whenever you made a foxhole, try to cover it as well as you can so it won't be visible, and also so it will shield you from bullet or bomb fragments, mortar fragments, shrapnel. And and he was just a friendly fellow, and taught me a lot about self-preservation during combat. Mm-hmm.
What were the other things he told you?
Well, try to stay as low as you could to the ground, and then we just talked about things. He would tell me about life in St. Louis and how they played a game called bottle caps. They would get a stick and hold it like a bat, and some other kid would throw bottle caps. That was pop bottles at that time had a cap on them. And instead of having a baseball and a regular bat, they would have this stick, and they would toss bottle caps, and you'd try to bat them back. And just friendly things like that. Kind of make it so you felt at home with them.
So you were telling us about your first experience on the front lines
Mhm.
that night. After that, please take us through what happens to you.
Okay. Well, there was quite a bit of fighting going in a place called the Hurtgen Forest. That's Huertgen, the Hurtgen Forest, and that was in, I think it was in Belgium. And we went in there, and it was just a real dark, tree-shaded place, and there had been some fighting there before. But the way we went through it, they would bring a tank in, and then they would spray the area with 50 caliber machine gun fire to keep the Germans down, and we would go through and try to occupy it, and it was just quite a bit of firing going on there. The worst part about it was the Germans would fire mortar shells, and they would set the fuses so that the shells would go off when they would hit trees, the tops of trees, and that shrapnel then would just spray down over the ground. I never got hit by any of it, but I was awful close to it most of the time. But that was the big danger going through there. After we'd been in there for several days, I don't know how long, we came to the edge of it, and there was a little town over there. So we went into that town along towards the evening, and there was a building that had been damaged some by artillery fire, and we moved in there because it was still habitable. We could still live in there. I spent the night, early part of the night, relieving some people that had been watching down the street, and they said they'd seen some Germans come down that street, but they didn't fire at them, and the Germans didn't know they were there, so they didn't fire at them either. Anyway, I took my place during the night at that window, and nothing happened during the night. When I went to lay down at night and go to sleep, I woke up, and it was, I think that was Thanksgiving Day of that year. It was in November. And President Roosevelt said every American serviceman would have a turkey dinner on that day. So about just after dark, sure enough, a Jeep rolled up, and they had some big vats of coffee and some turkey sandwiches. So I had coffee and a turkey sandwich on Thanksgiving. That was my Thanksgiving dinner that day. I ate it over a newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, so I could pick up all the crumbs and eat them. Wouldn't miss anything. Anyway, I spent the night in that situation, and then in the morning I woke up and I had some sea rations, so I opened them for my breakfast. And as I was eating my breakfast, a German plane came over, and during the night 2 tanks had rolled up on either side of that building, and that German warplane strafed those tanks first thing in the morning. Well, one of the bullets came through the bore above me, and it pierced the edge of my helmet and sprayed my face with a whole bunch of little fragments of shrapnel, probably from my helmet, maybe from the bullet, and it tore a gash in my right ear. I was just losing a lot of blood at that time. My ears really bled when they were wounded. So they took me to the battalion aid station, and the doctor there looked at it, and he said, "We can't do anything here. he put a big bandage over my ear to keep it from bleeding, and they loaded me onto a Jeep. There was 4 of us, I think, on the Jeep. There was one laying on the hood on a stretcher, and 2 of us sitting in the back, and then the driver. And they took us out to where they could put us on an ambulance. The ambulance took us to Liège, Belgium, where there was a 77th Evacuation Field Hospital set up. It was sort of like the MASH hospitals that you see on television. And they took us in there, and the nurse that triaged us, she said, "Hey, this kid is from Kansas." And it turned out that the hospital was staffed by doctors and nurses from the University of Kansas. So they made me feel real comfortable. I felt good when I got in there. Anyway, when they saw the what wounds I had, they sent me to a plastic surgery section. And the doctor there introduced himself, and he said he knew the doctor from my hometown that was practicing in my hometown. He'd gone to school with him. And so he explained what he was going to do. He was going to deaden that area with local anesthetic, and then he would dig out those little pieces of shrapnel that were in my face, and they would do the wound in my ear. They would suture it up so it would heal up. Well, that went on very well, and they kept me in the hospital for about 3 or 4 days. The hospital was blacked out. They had blankets hanging over all the windows so that Germans couldn't see it from the air. And during the night you could hear what they called buzz bombs. They were first rockets go over on their way to England, and that was quite a upsetting thing to hear those things go over, because you knew if one of them stopped buzzing, it was going to land pretty close to where you were. But most of them went on over, and I suppose they went to England or went down in the Channel or somewhere. Anyway, they sent me to a hospital near Paris, and I remember going down the Champs-Élysées in a bus with the other wounded people on it. And we passed the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe, and they took us to a base hospital in a town called Isigny, Isigny. And we were there, and it was very comfortable. We slept in tents, and there was about 20 people to a tent, and there was one nurse and one corpsman that took care of our needs and everything. It was very comfortable. After we'd been there about, I'd say 8 or 10 days, the German counteroffensive through the Ardennes exploded. And of course the troops were being driven back, and so they very quickly took my stitches out, gave me a new helmet and a new rifle, and sent me back to the front. We went on a train in boxcars. There were about 40 men to a boxcar. They were called 40 and 8s. It would hold 40 men or 8 horses. Well, we went back to the front lines, and by the time we got back, it was Christmas. It was right after Christmas. And the fighting had stopped the Germans. The Germans had started to retreat then, of course, and we were right on the very front line between the German front and the American front. They told me when I got back that on Christmas Eve night, you could hear the Germans, the fighting had stopped, and you could hear the Germans singing Christmas carols and hymns over the prairie between the American lines and the German lines. And so that was a kind of a pause in the war because of the Christmas holiday. We were in that front line there for probably, 2 or 3 weeks, quite a while, on into February, I guess, maybe March. And my friend from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, he and I were the Browning automatic rifle team. And we had a trench, or a foxhole, that was long enough we could lay down in it. And it was covered with branches and limbs, like the sergeant from St. Louis told me. And we could lay in there with a candle for light. And we slept in that with heavy woolen clothing and boots and everything. We couldn't change our clothes or anything. We slept in that thing for several weeks and didn't have a bath or anything like that, but we always had food, and it was pretty quiet. There wasn't anything going on. Then, I would say 6 weeks later, the offensive was scheduled to start again. So we were routed out of bed real early in the morning. It was probably 4 o'clock. And there was a battery of cannons behind us, howitzers, I guess they were. And they were bombarding a little German village across the way. It was, I don't know how far, probably a couple miles or so, maybe farther. And they started about 4 o'clock, and they bombarded that place till daylight. And then at daylight, we had to move across a snow-covered field, and it was wrecked by machine gun fire all the time we were going across it. We were crossing it, and we saw one of our party, he was a sergeant, leaning against a tree stump, and he didn't move. So a friend of mine tossed a snowball at him, and it hit him, and he didn't move or anything. So we knew he'd been killed. He'd been hit by machine gun fire and dead. So we ran as fast as we could across that, and the bullets, tracer bullet, about every sixth bullet was a tracer bullet, and they came running right at us. It looked like they were coming right into us. And we ran as fast as we could till we got across that snow-covered field. When we got across it, we found a little masonry building on the other side of it with a kind of an L-shaped place we thought would be a little bit safer from the machine gun fire. So we went in there for shelter. Well, we hadn't much more than gone in there till a German grenade came out of the window about two floors above us, and it exploded and wounded one of our men in the throat. It wasn't a deadly wound. He was bleeding quite a bit from it, and we took care of him. But then the German poked a submachine gun out of the window and started shooting at us. Well, my friend Sergeant Horvath said, "The window, shoot at the window. Every time that gun comes out, give it shoot it as fast as you can." So we did that, and it kept the machine gunner from poking his gun out of the window again, and we were relatively safe from that. And somehow they got word to a bazooka man, and he came up, and on one of the side windows he shot a bazooka into the building, and I think that stopped the skirmish at that time. But that was the only really firefight that I ever got at where we used our own guns and shot at the Germans that were shooting at us. And it quieted down that day, and the rest of the day was pretty quiet. The Germans were surrendering. They were coming out. They were shaking. Their heads were pounding and from the artillery fire. And the ones that survived surrendered, of course. Well, that night after the fighting wore down, while we bunked in a building there, and I took my backpack off, and there was a bullet hole right through my backpack, through my mess kit, and it was no longer usable, so I had to get a new mess kit. But that bullet had just missed my heart and lungs by that far, just a few inches. And so that's the two closest calls I had, the bullet that went through my helmet in the Hurtgen Forest, and then that bullet that pierced my backpack in that German offensive after it was after the Battle of the Bulge. Then we were driving the Germans back into Germany. So that was my two closest calls. Anyway, things quieted down. We were on the west bank of the Rhine River then, the Western Front, and we were bunked into a little. It might have been a hotel or something. It was a German building of some kind, and we were there for several days. And then one day the Sergeant Horvath came in, and he said he had a copy of the Stars and Stripes, and he said, "Read ye and weep. They've crossed the Rhine River at Remagen, and we're supposed to go down and exploit that bridgehead." So they loaded us into trucks and took us down to where the Remagen Bridge was. By that time, the Germans had knocked one of the spans out of the bridge, so you couldn't go across the bridge anymore. But we loaded into squad-sized motorboats, and we crossed the Rhine River in those motorboats about probably a quarter of a mile to a half a mile north of the Remagen Bridge that had been captured. We landed in a little bridgehead that they had there, and it was just getting dark. And we went in, and the Germans were pounding everything they could into that bridgehead to try to get us retreat. And I couldn't see anybody to shoot at or do anything, but I wanted to stay safe as I could, so I dug it was a foxhole, but it wasn't really a hole. It was just more of a slit trench that I could get it down in below the surface of the ground, and that sheltered me from a lot of the explosions and mortar shells and shrapnel that was going through the air. But the German tanks, you could hear them out in front. They had a certain squeaky sound to their treads on the tanks, and they were trying to drive us out of there. Well, we managed to get through the night and hold that bridgehead, and then just at dawn, you could hear the sound of American warplanes coming over, and there were P-47 Thunderbolts, and they would fly over and they would dive towards the German positions, strafing them with 50 caliber bullets, and then at the bottom of their drive, they would release a 500-pound bomb. Well, it didn't take long for that kind of pounding to quiet the Germans. And the Germans then didn't put any more resistance to it, and we were able to secure the bridgehead and have a secure place across the Rhine River. That was the crossing of the Rhine. Well, from then on, it was pretty easy going across Germany. They brought up tanks, and we would, 7 or 8 of us would get on the back of a tank, and we would go down the roads or the highways, whatever we could find, through the German countryside, and you could tell that it was very well developed. They had very good agriculture fields with crops in them, and places that they could be just without any fighting at all. The Germans were just tending to retreat across. I remember one of the nights that we got into a little town, and it was right along a river or a canal or something, and there were bridges over it. Anyway, we camped, brought up our company on the west side of the bank of the canal, and my companion and I went up to the second floor of the building that was next there, and we were looking out the window. It was getting dark, and our lieutenant came out and and was going to direct a tank in to cover the bridge over that river or canal. And he was shouting at the German, or the commander of the tank. And as the tank came around, we could see the peculiar muzzle brake that were on the end of the tank. The Germans had those quite a bit. We hadn't started to have them yet, but I had heard that they were a few of them coming over now that did have that appliance on there, so we thought it was an American tank coming around. Well, he stopped right under our window, and the commander opened up the hatch and put his head up and started to shout something in German. And so the lieutenant knew that it wasn't an American tank, it was a German tank. So he yelled something to get back, and he started running away. And the German must have heard him, and he knew that he was behind American lines. So he clanged the top down on that tank, and then he raced across that bridge, and just as fast as he could. So that was, I guess, one of the last times we encountered the Germans. Anyway, the survivor, the German survivor, the American lieutenant, and me and my companion all survived the war, so that was good. We got into a place called the Hartz Mountains. It was a hospital town. It was used for recovering German wounded soldiers and places like that. And we occupied that without really much damage. A German officer came out and surrendered to me. I was in the middle of the street, and he surrendered to me, and he could speak enough English and I could get enough German that we kind of understand one another, and he wanted to surrender. And so I said, okay, do you have any guns? He said, yes, in the building there's 2 pistols. So the fellow that was with me went inside, and he got those pistols. He gave me one, and he kept one for himself. And we told the German to go down the road, and he would be come to a prisoner stockade, and they would take him in, and he would have warm food and good clothes, and he was just happy to be over the war then. I was glad to find he was going to be safe. And that was the end of the fighting there. We came over, this is getting into April, I think. We came to a place that was supposedly safe, and I still don't know what happened. They had set up a kitchen, and we could go through and get food to eat. And this is one of the saddest parts of the war. We got our food, and we found a foxhole, and we sat down on the edge of that foxhole and were eating our food. And we got mail that day, and this fella, he was from Louisiana. His name was L.B. Thiel, and he had gotten a picture of his wife and 2 small children. I still don't remember for sure, but I think it was a picture because they didn't have much colored photography at that time, but I'll just about bet that if you were a soldier and there was any colored pictures or colored photography in the town, they would see that you got a film of it you could send to your people that were overseas. Well, he'd gotten a picture and a letter from his wife and these 2 kids, and he was just tickled to death with it, and he handed it to me, and I looked at it, and just as I was handing it back to him, a mortar shell landed, and it just was a terrible explosion. A piece of it hit my leg, but it didn't penetrate. It was just hot, and it burned my calf of my leg. But shrapnel hit him full blast and just shredded him. It just took his head off, and I didn't really stop and look at it. I just crawled out of the foxhole and went down to the aid station to see if they could do anything for my leg. But I felt so bad about that because the war was almost over. It was just within weeks of the German surrender. It was in April, and they surrendered on May the 8th, so if he could have survived that. And I never could think what the Germans would be doing. I just almost wonder if it wasn't a friendly fire of a short round, a round that didn't have enough powder or something to make it all the way. I don't know. But it was just, I've never forgot that. Okay. And that was one. The only other thing I remember from the war was one time we were going through a minefield, and there was this soldier laying on the other side of the tape that was safe to go across the minefield. And he was a black soldier, he was an African American. And I've often thought that he must have been a volunteer, because I think most of the black soldiers were assigned non-combat roles in hauling ammunition and hauling hospitals and hauling kitchens and stuff like that. But he had to almost be a volunteer to have been in a combat area, and I felt really what his background was, because he might have been a college student or something like that. And felt bad about that. And well, anyway, that was close to the end of the war. We came into a German. It was a castle, actually. It was some of the nobility had a castle there. And the next day we were supposed to clear out the woods that are ahead of it. We were getting close to the Russians. And in the morning we assembled and started to clear out this forest of woods. And about 11 o'clock, this Jeep come roaring down the road. And they said, "The Germans have surrendered. The Germans have surrendered." And so we didn't know whether it was true or not, but apparently it turned out to be true. And we fired our guns into the air. I think that was kind of a dangerous thing to do, but we were so happy that the war was supposedly over that we fired into the air. And then after things quieted down, we pulled back into this little town, and we stayed there for, several weeks. I don't know how long. It was a railroad town at the base of this little castle. And they had the kitchen set up in the courtyard of the castle, so we went up every day to have our meals. And the lady that owned the castle, she must have been a countess or something like that. She would invite us inside sometimes to look around. And pretty much that was the end of the war. Then we were assigned to a German airfield that was a roundup place for German displaced people. And they rounded them up to people that were to go into their hometowns or wherever they needed to go, and would load them into trucks, and then a couple of us would get in the truck to kind of guard them, and we'd go back to wherever that contingent went. I know one of them went through Heidelberg, and that's the only town I remembered that I knew about that we went through. And after that, things quieted down. We finally were billeted in Nuremberg, Germany. We were in a suburb of Nuremberg. They took over the home of a banker in a town called Fürth, F-U-R-T-H. And they took over his house, and we lived in that. And I was transferred to a transportation company, and I was then a clerk, and I could type, so I typed things and did office work from the rest of the war on. We had a teletype machine in there, and some of the Germans were teletype operators and telephone operators and things like that. And we pretty much spent the rest of the summer in that, in the fall. And then that fall, some of us got a Jeep, and we could visit some of the towns in Germany. We went to a town called Oberammergau that had been a well-known German war, well, even before the war, because they had survived the Great Plague of the 1700s, and they counted it to the being kind of isolated from the rest of Germany, and they didn't get the contagious disease that they had during that time. And I was there for till in February, I guess, and then we were repatriated home to the United States, and I was discharged and sent back to Larned. So.
I really appreciate you sharing all of that, Dr. Harwood. I want to go. You gave so much information. I want to go over some things.
Okay, sure.
So the first thing is, can you explain a little bit more about the incident when you got hit in the ear?
Yeah.
So how did the German plane actually?
Well, there was a tank sitting outside of this building on one side. Okay. Well, there was a tank on each side of that building, an American tank. And I went down into the basement of the building, spent the night, was having breakfast, and this German plane came over, and he strafed that tank that was on this side of the building, and some bullets went through the floor of the building, and then he strafed the tank on the other side. Well, one of those bullets went through the edge of my helmet, and the helmet was made out of metal, and of course the bullet shattered some of it into small pieces of shrapnel. And then the bullet itself went through the outer part of my ear. I had to have some stitches stuck to put my ear back together.
Got it. Thank you for that detail.
Yeah.
Do me a favor. You want to take a swig, sir?
What?
Do you want to take a swig of water?
Okay, yeah.
You're doing great. So I'm going to ask you just some general questions about combat, and then we'll get more into some of your... There's some specifics that I definitely want to go over.
All right.
And then, are you cold?
No.
Okay, because I see you rubbing your arms.
No, that's me.
You're okay.
Yeah.
So, could you please tell us about any experiences you had with German planes? Other times where you strafed or bombed?
No, the German Air Force was pretty quiet at that time. They said if you saw an American plane, it would usually come over in squadrons or a number of planes. If you saw only one plane, it was usually a German. And that was because they just were shepherding their planes. They didn't have that many. Every night, a plane would come over very high in the sky, too high to shoot at or anything. But they were a reconnaissance plane, I guess, coming over to show where the line was, the front line was. And that was what we called him Bed Check Charlie, because he'd come over every night just at dusk to see where the lines were.
Did you have any experiences listening to Axis Sally?
Axis Sally? No, never did.
You've heard of her, yeah?
I've heard of it, yeah. Yeah. We didn't have radios or anything.
Can you tell me an overview? Can you give us an overview of what were the living conditions like on the front lines? If you were to describe it to someone who didn't know anything about World War II, how would you describe the infantry living conditions?
Okay. We never changed our clothes to go to sleep at night. We slept in our uniforms. They were wool. They were pretty warm, and we had overcoats and heavy boots to wear. And we'd sleep, usually trying to find a sheltered place to sleep, a foxhole or a building or something like that if we could. The food was almost always a field kitchen, and we had mess kits that we could put our food in and then go sit somewhere and eat it on the outside. And then they would have some big tubs that you could wash them out in and put them back in your backpack.
And can you tell us, did you have any experiences with German snipers?
Yeah. I remember one time we were in a forest, and there was what they called a fire break. So if a forest got on fire, these breaks would be wide enough. They were probably, probably about the length of a football field. And we came up on this one, the whole squad did, and we wanted to cross it, and we came with the idea of what would be the best way to cross it. Would we all go at once, and then if he shot, he would probably get one of us. And if we went one at a time, he'd have to shoot at each one of us, and probably losing a target that way, he wouldn't have much chance. So anyway, we made the decision to go one at a time. So the first one went across, and then the next one came right after him, and by that time then he'd have to load his gun again and take aim and shoot at him. Well, he missed him, and then he'd have to work his gun again and take a shot at the next one. He missed him, worked the gun again 5 times, I think. No, 6 times. There was one in the chamber and 5 other ones. And he had 6 times to get us, but he didn't get any of us. So that was a sniper that, about the only time I had a sniper.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, sir.
Okay, this is an episode of 2 tanks, one German, one an American. And we were in a little valley between them. They were one on the ridge of the left and the other on the ridge to the right. And we were well below where the tanks were. Well, they started firing at one another, and didn't take long before the Germans set the American tank on fire, because the tanks on of our American tanks used aviator fuel for their engines, and they were very open to fire. The German tanks had diesel fuel, and they were hard to set on fire. So we were down in the valley between these two, and they shot back and forth over us, but we were not in any danger of getting hit. But we did see the American tank put out of commission by the German tank, and I'm sure the tankers all perished in that fire. Mm-hmm.
How far were they from you?
Oh, they were probably, I'd say it could have been a mile across that, maybe a mile and a half.
And were they moving around firing at each other, or were they just stationary?
They were pretty much stationary. They might have moved a little bit along there, but they weren't moving around very much. They were taking aim at the other tank, and that's what they were doing, yeah.
There's so much to talk to you about. You have a wonderful memory. Can you talk about some of the patrols that you went on, please?
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. We came back, like I say, in January of 45. Yeah, in January of 45. And there was this long extent of a hedgerow toward the German lines. And so they wanted us to patrol that to see if there was any Germans along there. So I was picked to lead the patrol, and I led him down that hedgerow, and it was snowing. It wasn't really a blizzard, but it was a bad snowstorm. And we trudged through the snow down there to the end of it, and we didn't encounter any Germans at all. So we came back, and I remember there was icicles dripping off of my helmet when we got back, and we told them we didn't encounter any German fire or any German soldiers at all. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the first German casualties that you came across?
Yes. That was in the mountainous part of Germany, and it was snowy, and there was deep snow, and there were German soldiers that had been killed that were frozen stiff, and they were plowed up, I guess. I don't know how they did it, but they were laying on the snow in frozen positions just like they died. And I remember one time we were in a hedgerow, and I heard this German youngster, and he was yelling Mutter, Mutter, Mutter. He was calling for his mother. And I suppose he had been wounded, probably not mortally. Probably eventually somebody picked him up, probably Americans, and took him back to an American hospital, I would imagine. But he was scared and calling for his mother, and I could really identify with how he felt. And, yeah, it kind of tore your heartstrings.
What was your job in Company I?
Job in the company? Well, it was to carry this machine gun, Browning automatic rifle, actually, but it was really a machine gun. And then my assistant would carry ammunition for it. And I suppose it was to be used in fire-to-fire combat, but we never ran across enough of those to really fire it very much. And that was my main thing. And then the other thing was to, dig cat holes for toiletry and, well, of course, when we were in barracks, we had to clean the barracks and sweep the barracks and stuff like that. But we weren't very often in barracks. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us, besides the one time when you fired at the window with the BAR, were there any other instances where you fired any weapons?
No, and I didn't fire at that time. The guys on the ground fired at it because I was so dumbfounded I didn't really react to what was going on. But they fired their rifles at it, and that kept the guy from appearing again. And then whether they got him with a bazooka or not, I don't know. I don't know what happened to him, but he quit firing anyway.
Wasn't there an incident where there was a machine gun, a German machine gunner that you could have knocked out if you had gone around the side?
Yeah, that was when we were crossing the...
Can you tell us that full story?
Okay, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. We were moving into this little valley. Well, I guess it wasn't really a valley. It was just kind of a wooded area. And we'd gotten mail that morning and before we moved, and this fellow, John Olson, I think his name was, had got a letter from his wife. It was what was called a Dear John letter. She had hooked up with somebody else, and she no longer had any use for him. Really was depressed. And as we were moving up this area, a machine gun opened up on us, and I could see just the puffs of smoke from the machine gun, and it hit John, and he was thrashing around telling him, I'm hit, I'm sure. I don't think it was a mortal hit. I think that if the medics got to him in time, probably they were able to save him. I never did hear for sure, but he would have never been in combat again. And I suppose if I'd have thought about it, I could have I was kind of at the side and behind the machine gun. I was probably out of danger, but I was a 19-year-old kid, and I just didn't react fast enough. And I don't think I should have been in combat. I should have been a medic or something like that. Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of the experiences you had with German artillery? Can you describe what is it like to be in an artillery bombardment?
Well, I don't know that I was ever in a really artillery bombardment. Most of the shells that we had were mortar shells, and they were fired one at a time by the Germans. And like I say, the shells around would fire. The treetops, they would go what were called tree explosions. They set the fuse on them so that it didn't take much to make them explode. And then that shrapnel would go down across the ground. That was mostly what I had. I don't think I was ever in what they call the 88s, the ones that shot at tanks. They were more, they had, we didn't have that kind of a target for them. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about, can you tell us more about the Hurtgen Force? What are some of the specific engagements that stick out to you?
Well, the fighting in it was very wooded. You didn't hardly know where the front was or anything. We were in the probably less dangerous part of it, or the less fierce part of the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. But some of it was just little towns fighting back and forth, and roadways that were being blocked by tree trunks and things, and it was just we were less danger than a lot of the people were in the Hurtgen Forest, but it was a bad place. Mm-hmm.
And when you're in a forest that thick, how do you even see the enemy?
That's right. You just don't a lot of times. Uh-huh.
And can you tell us a little bit more about the tree bursts?
Mm-hmm.
So that's when the German artillery or the mortars would hit a tree?
Yeah, well, they would explode high enough that they would go off and then shatter a large area with shrapnel. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember, when you were on the front lines, I know that everyone carried a first aid kit.
Mm-hmm.
Were there times that you had to help some of the other wounded or provide first aid?
No, I never did.
Could you please tell us about Sergeant Horvath?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What happened to him?
Okay, well, he was the friendly fellow from St. Louis, and I always felt bad that I never got a hold of his family or anybody, because we were, really good friends. But at that time, we didn't have cell phones. Long distance was expensive. I didn't have a car, and traveling that far or getting a hold of anybody was just hard to do. But anyway, what happened was after we crossed the Rhine, we were the fighting had died down after the Americans had rescued us from that bridgehead, and we could be a little bit more open. And I know he was taking his socks and shoes off because they were probably wet or damp from the water, and letting them dry out, and a mortar shell came in and killed him. So I felt really bad about that. Mm-hmm.
Were you with him when that happened?
No, I was quite a ways away. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about him? What kind of man was he?
Oh, he was about 30 years old, I guess. He was kind of a rugged, red-headed fellow, and always seemed to be in good spirits and everything like that.
Did he have a family?
I suppose he did. I don't know that he did, but I imagine he did because he was old enough. And I always felt bad that I had never tried to get in touch with him. Mm-hmm.
Maybe they'll see this.
Huh?
Maybe they'll see
They might, yeah. If they do, I hope they don't. Of course, they won't be able to get a hold of me, but I'm too old.
No,
Mm-hmm.
we can provide a way. If they get in touch with us, we can.
Well, if they do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So what was his first name?
Robert
Robert Horvath.
Horvath, and he was what they call a buck sergeant. He had 3 stripes.
From St. Louis.
From St. Louis, and he was in Company I of the 26th Infantry Regiment.
Yeah, I know there's another story you have about something to do with bricks and an old German lady.
Yeah, we were on the banks of the Rhine River on the safe side after the crossing had been made, and no, I guess it was before the crossing had been made, but we had a little kind of a cave or cabin or something, and it was cold, and I went out looking for some briquettes to have a fire in there. I was going to bring some back, and this little old lady came out, and she just was really upset with me taking her bricks away from her, briquettes, because they were hard to find, and she gave me a bad time, and so I gave the bricks back to her. I was just a kid, I was only 19 years old. I wasn't grown up yet.
What did you tell your officers?
Oh, they didn't care. I mean, there wasn't any officers. It was just I think Bob Horvath was one of them, and they didn't worry about it very much.
So as I go through this, I'm just going to ask you a couple of general things.
Mhm.
When you were in England, did you get a chance to go to London?
No, no.
Did you see any of the towns that you were in?
Well, I think I told you that we landed at Southampton, and that's not true. I remembered afterwards. We landed at Liverpool, and we went to an army camp near Liverpool. And then when we left Liverpool, we were on a train to Southampton, and that was right on the terminal of the ferry that went across to France. So,
Yeah, no, I know. So I figured that you were just trying to remember so much. At
yeah,
once.
right. Uh-huh.
Um,
I should have read those over. I would have had a little bit fresher.
so could you tell us the towns that you were in England? What do you remember about the destruction?
No, I wasn't in any place that had been destroyed. This army camp had suffered no damage, and it was probably away from the.
What about the places in Germany? Can you describe the destruction done to the towns and cities?
Well, Nuremberg had quite a bit of damage, and part of it they tried to spare as much as some of those towns as they could, but there was a part of Nuremberg that had been bombed and destroyed. But I hadn't seen the real damage in like Berlin or any of those towns. Most of the towns we were in hadn't had that much destruction. That little town outside of the Hürtgen Forest, of course, had been partially destroyed, mostly by mortar and artillery fire, I suppose.
Could you tell us about the Siegfried Line?
I didn't ever see any of the Siegfried Line.
None of the dragon teeth?
I never saw the dragon teeth or any of that. We got past that, I guess, at Aachen, maybe.
Well, tell us, when you landed in France,
Mm-hmm.
how did you get sent to the front at Aachen? What was that journey like?
What was new?
When you landed on the coast of France,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
how did you get to Aachen?
Okay, we went up the side of the cliff over the Omaha Beach, and we were loaded into trucks and taken to a replacement depot. And from the replacement depot, then we went up through Belgium, France and Belgium, to Aachen. And when Aachen surrendered, then we went into it.
I know that there was some other towns that you went through that
Mhm.
had some damage, right? Like St. Lo?
Oh, yeah, St. Lo, boy. There wasn't one brick standing on another in St. Lo. I forgot about that. That was just, I'd never seen anything so destroyed as St. Lo was, yeah.
What else did you see there?
Well, we just drove through it on a bus, on a truck, so I just saw the piles of rubble is about all. Mm-hmm.
Didn't you see someone from your hometown?
Oh, yeah, we were going under a underpass, under a railroad, and that somebody had written Larned, Kansas on it. When I got back to my home after the war, I talked that around a little bit, and they said it must have been a guy named Junior Ferguson that was over there. He might have done it. But I never did talk to him, never did know for sure.
You just have to give me one sec. I'm trying to think, you've covered a lot, pretty much all. Can you talk a little bit about your faith? Were there times on the front lines that you prayed?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
This little New Testament was given to me by my church on the day I left, and said to Claude Harwood Jr. from the Christian Church, Larned, Kansas, with a sincere hope that from these pages you may receive strength and courage and wisdom every day. Signed, your church. And I had that in a pocket over my heart, and I wrapped it in some kind of plastic that we had food in, so it wouldn't get wet. Yeah, that's always been quite a thing for me.
So that's the original?
That's the original, yeah.
Wow. Were there times on the front that you would pull it out and go through it?
Actually, that's the hard thing. I didn't. It was almost like an amulet of some kind. If I had it with me, I felt its protection, but I never did really take it out to read it. I did a little bit, maybe in basic training.
No, I know what you mean. You know, being there is your connection.
Yeah, right.
So, how would you describe combat to someone who's never gone through it? How would you describe the feelings, what it's like?
Well, it's high stress. You just do what you have to do. You've been trained, you know, to go where they tell you to go and to do what you have to do to get through it. But I don't know how to tell you. I was scared, and I said, like this book, I prayed a time or two when I was in it that I would get through it, but I knew I'd have to do whatever I had to do to carry out my mission and to be with the other soldiers and protect them, and you just have to do it.
Can you tell us about communication? How did you communicate back home, and who did you communicate with?
Well, the only communication I had was with my folks, my parents, and that was by what they called V-mail. That was, they would fill out these little forms with your letter, and then they would photograph it on film, and they would fly those films back, and then they would print them off on photographic paper and mail them to my folks, and it was usually about a probably 7 to 10 day difference between that. If you sent regular mail, it was longer than that. It was probably 2 or 3 weeks before they would come back and forth.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
No, I was the only one.
So what was that like for your parents, sending their only kid to war?
Well, I know it was. They were just devastated, but I didn't know what to do about it. I was drafted and told to go, you know. You see this movie, Saving Private Ryan. I always thought, I wish they'd have tried to save me, but they didn't. If they had, I wouldn't have all this story to tell.
I've never heard that. Can you tell us about that last time you saw your folks? Did you have a furlough before you went overseas?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about what that was like? Because, there was a very good chance you would not be coming home alive.
Yeah, right.
So tell us about that.
Well,
did you guys go out or something?
No, my folks, I spent a lot of time with them. I ate at home, and I went down to the plumbing shop and spent time with my dad. And, we went to church. And some of my relatives there, I visited with them, tried to keep contact with them. The interesting thing was that it rained real hard, and the trains weren't going, so I had to fly in a private plane to Wichita, where I could get on a bus and then go back to the camp. And I was a little bit late, and they weren't happy about that, but they contacted my people at Larned, and they told them about the rain, and it was hard for me to get out of town. So I made my best way to get there.
Can you tell us about some of the friends you made at basic training, please?
Yeah. One of them was, what was his name?
Paul.
Paul. Do I have his name down there? He was from Indiana.
Just hang on one sec. I don't see his name in here.
Well, anyway, we kind of gravitated together, I guess, because of probably our religious background. He was a person that had a strong religious background, and he would always come up with scripture for any problem we had, you know. And when we went through, and another fellow I knew was Jim Honnier. He was from Texas, and he was a great tall fellow. He should have been playing basketball for Texas University or something instead of being in the Army, but he wound up in the Army anyway. And when we were separated at the replacement depot, they both went to a different company, and they were both killed in the Battle of the Bulge. So that was kind of a sad thing for me.
How did you find out that they had been killed?
I didn't find out till after the war was over. I could type, and they put me to work typing what they called awards and well, it was anyway when you got a medal for about anything, and most of those guys got a Bronze Star or something. Then they wrote up a brief description of how they were killed, and I was to go through that and make a narrative of their service in the Army and how they try to make it soft, you know, so they wouldn't feel bad about it or anything. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember some of the things you wrote up?
Well, I wrote up about Paul. He was killed when a tank ran over him, and I don't remember much more than that. That was one of the most outstanding ones I had. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A tank ran over him?
Mm-hmm. A German tank. Mm-hmm.
He was trying to stop it, or?
Well, I don't know. He was probably bunkered down in a foxhole, and it wasn't deep enough or something. I don't know.
And so you would write the letter to the family?
Yeah, I'll write the notice to the family about it.
Well, I thought they just got a telegram saying so-and-so was killed in action.
Well, they might have, but then when they awarded him a Bronze Star and a combat badge and some of those awards that he got, well, they'd want to send something with that. That was all after the war.
I know we're scattering around, but just to go back to the incident, sir, with your ear injury,
mm-hmm.
Do you believe that was a German plane or an American plane?
Well, at the time, nobody saw the plane. The only thing we knew was that they had strafed those tanks, and I got hit by one of the bullets. But after the war was over, when they were recounting things like that, they say if you saw a German plane by itself, it was probably a plane by itself, it was probably German.
Okay.
Because Americans came over in formations.
And then when you were in the hospital with your injury,
mm-hmm.
What do you remember about some of the other wounded around you?
Well, there was one man right next to me, and he apparently had burns, gasoline burns or something, because he was all swathed in bandages all over. I didn't get to talk to him or anything. I just know that he was seriously wounded.
Is that when you got a Purple Heart, the actual medal?
Yeah.
How did they get that to you?
Well, when we were in that base hospital in Isigny, they came through one day and gave it. They had medals for everybody that had been wounded, and they gave me one then. And the Red Cross mailed it to my folks, so they got it right after I was wounded.
Could you tell us about your Christmas of 1944?
1944, yeah. I was in a boxcar on the way to the front.
What happened?
Well, it got what they called a hot box. One of the wheels wasn't lubricated properly, apparently, and it was singled out for lubrication, I guess is what happened. And they finally got it going again. And we went to the front.
But what did you do for Christmas?
Just ate a K ration in the car.
Did you have any experiences taking Germans prisoner?
Well, that one that I told you about that surrendered to me, and
But I meant like out in the field in combat.
no, I never did then.
Capturing?
Well, yeah, I guess the day the war was over, the Germans would try to come into our little village and surrender, but I never had any surrender to me. But I know they didn't want to get captured by the Russians, so they waited till dark and then would try to come in and go to a prisoner stockade.
You were telling us the story about crossing the open field.
Mm-hmm.
This is before you got into the engagement with the German on the second
Yeah.
story.
Mm-hmm.
When you were crossing that open field, where were the Germans? And
They were off to my right. They were firing machine guns from my right at us as we crossed, as we ran across that field.
I mean, sir, you were describing having machine gun bullets going right in front of you. How do you keep going forward?
You thought, well, you do it automatically, I guess. I wanted to get out of their line of fire, and I just ran as fast as I could. And one of them hit me, or hit my backpack, but I was fortunate enough that I didn't get killed.
During that attack, did you see some of the other men going down?
No, we were all running. Yeah, I don't think anybody else went down that I could see or I remember, except that one that was leaning against a tree stump.
Dylan.
Yeah, Sergeant Dillon, yeah.
What kind of person was Sergeant Dillon?
Oh, he was just a nice guy. He was friendly and he always had good word for everybody. You felt bad about him.
Did you all ever have services for the men who were killed?
No, not really over there.
Was there a chaplain attached to you?
We did have a chaplain. I saw him just before the war was over. On Easter, I guess it was. He brought a Jeep up and we had communion on the hood of that Jeep. It was about several hundred yards behind the line. Mm-hmm.
You told us the story about the German casualties, the frozen ones.
Uh-huh.
What about American casualties, or were they picked up early?
Apparently we weren't around where they were because I never did see an American casualty that way. That I can remember anyway.
Did you believe that you would survive the war?
Well, right in the middle of it, you just didn't think about that. You just tried to survive.
Did you have any experiences with Hitler Youth?
No. Well, yeah, after the war was over, there was a Hitler Youth that was attached to our unit, and I think he spoke good enough English and good enough German that he could interpret between our officers and the Germans.
What do you remember about the animals? The Germans had a lot of animals.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was sad. One of the sad things I saw too, that they would have lines of wagons pulled by horses, and they would be killed by the American strafing missions as they were bringing supplies to the front. Mm-hmm. Just seeing long lines of them that were laying there dead. Hmm.
Yeah, supposedly they had more horses than anything.
Yeah, they had horses that save trucks and stuff.
They say it's a mobilized army,
Hmm.
but most of it was horse drawn.
Well, by that time they were running out of. We'd bombed their trains and trucks and everything we could find. We had people in the air all over Germany.
Did you have any experiences with booby traps or mines?
I can't remember any. I don't think so.
When you guys were going into the German houses, you didn't have any fear of some of them being booby trapped?
Well, we didn't. I wasn't in any of that combat like they had in Aachen, so I didn't search out any houses. I had a machine gun or that BAR, and I was usually stationed at the end of a street or at a crossing or somewhere just to cover that.
Can you tell us about how you heard about the war getting over?
Yeah, this Jeep came roaring down the road.
I think that's yours.
Okay.
I'll put on pause. Could you tell us that story? How did you hear about the war getting over?
Okay, we were in this little wooded area in Czechoslovakia, and we were going to clear it out for the Germans. And about 11 o'clock, this Jeep came roaring down the road and said, "The Germans have surrendered. The Germans have surrendered." And so we didn't know whether to believe it or not right at first, but when we finally decided it was true, well, then people started firing their weapons straight up in the air. And that was just a celebration like the 4th of July, I guess, for people. They were so glad it was over with. We moved back into that little town, and it was a railroad town, and we stayed in a railroad station then for several weeks.
And my understanding is you had something to do with the Nuremberg trials, right?
Well, my outfit did, the 26th Infantry, but I wasn't part of that. By that time, I was a clerk typist in the office.
And did you have any experience? Can you tell us about when you were guarding the POW camp, please?
Oh, yeah, one time I was on guard out there, and these 3 people came up and they wanted to come into the gate I was guarding. I said, "Well, you can't come in here. You'll have to go somewhere else." And they just got kind of belligerent and said, "No, we want to come in here." So I kind of stepped back, and I had an M1 rifle, and I rattled the rifle as I loaded it and everything, and I pointed it at them. I said, "No, you're not coming in here." So they finally decided that was too dangerous for this kid with a rifle.
So after your time overseas, could you please take us through how you came home?
How I came home? We came home on what was called a Liberty ship. They were ships that were made to haul supplies and people and just about everything. It was just an ordinary ship. We had fresh milk and good food on the ship. And we came into New York, and I got to see the Statue of Liberty then. I didn't see it on the way out.
What was that like to see?
Well, it was quite impressive to see that. Yeah.
And then?
Then I got on a train, and let's see. I think we left New York and went to, I don't know, we were on trains till I got to Fort Leavenworth. Then at Fort Leavenworth, while I was mustered out, I was given a little pin that showed I was a veteran, and discharge papers, and everything I needed to re-enter civilian life.
Did you have difficulties readjusting to civilian life?
I don't think so.
No nightmares?
No. I think one time I was in a movie theater and there was a thunderstorm outside, and one clap of thunder was just like when I would hear artillery. I'd try to get down between the seats for a minute, but I realized that the war was over and I wasn't in any danger.
Can you tell us about what that reunion with your family was like the first time you saw them after coming overseas?
Yeah, they came to Newton to get me off. To get me, I was going to go on the train farther, but that would have taken several hours longer. So they drove to Newton, Kansas, and I got off of the train there. And of course, I hugged them, and my mother kissed me, and we got in the little pickup truck that my dad had for his plumbing business, and we rode back home. It's kind of interesting that nobody ever wanted to know about my experience during the war. None of my relatives ever did, and I never did share a lot of this stuff with them.
They never asked?
No, they were just so glad to get me home that all that was behind them. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us then, what did you end up doing with your life?
Well, I went to work with my dad for a while until I got into college at the University of Kansas, and then I went to Kansas University and got a degree there in undergraduate work, and then I enrolled in medical school. I got into medical school, and about halfway through medical school, I met my wife. She was a pharmacy student, and we went together till she graduated, and then she got a really good pharmacy job, and so we'd planned on getting married anyway when I got through school. So she said, well, why do we have to wait? She says, I've got a good job and I can support us. And we got married, and she supported me the rest of the way through medical school. And she was a good person to do a lot of our planning and financials, and she just was a wonderful person to work with. Mm-hmm.
And so after medical school, well, what type of medicine did you study, by the way?
Yeah, just in general medicine, what was called general practitioner.
And so
I went to what was called a internship, where I delivered a bunch of babies while I was an intern, and helped with surgery, and then I just saw general patients, with the sniffles and the cough and all the things people have, and I was pretty well prepared for that. So this little town needed a doctor. The doctor that they had just left. He was a veteran, and I think he had some mental problems because he wound up committing suicide. And so I came out here, and they helped me set up a clinic, and that was it.
And so how long did you end up practicing in Glasgow?
About 34 years, about that, till I was 65 years old. And then I retired. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't have. I should have stayed with it, but my wife was, like I say, she wanted to have some time to travel and be with the kids and everything like that. And then about 10 years after I retired, she started to develop symptoms of mental Alzheimer's dementia. So I'm glad I did have some time with her, that I didn't have to just run and go all the time.
Mm-hmm. I know you say you retired, but you're not really retired, right? Because people in this town really...
Oh, yeah, they want opinions a lot of times, but I don't keep up. I can't keep up with the stuff that they do now.
I know you're very admired in this town.
Mm-hmm. Well,
They
maybe,
really-
I don't know. Mm-hmm.
I think they think the world of you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If people see you, they just call you Doc, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
What advice do you want to give to future generations, sir?
Well, I guess I would advise them not to set up with this solo practice. I think they need to be with a group of doctors that can share time off and share a lot of opinions and things like that.
I also meant like just not life advice
Uh-huh.
for anyone.
Life advice? Well, I don't know. I felt that my religious association gave me a lot of strength to go through tough times that I wouldn't have had if I had a religious background and faith in God and faith in the teachings of the Bible and a lot of that. And I think that's what we're going through in the country now. We have so many people that are just, they don't have any faith background or anything, and they don't know what to do with tough times.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
What can future generations do to make you feel like the sacrifices you made, seeing these people around you getting killed, what can they do to make you feel like it was worth it, sir?
Well, I always feel bad about those two people I knew, one from Texas and one from Indiana, Paul and Jim. Their life was just sacrificed to keep this country going and out of the way things were going at that time, and I just feel like that was a terrible thing to have to do that. Mm-hmm.
And the last thing, sir, is what kind of person do you want people to always think of you as what kind of man?
I have never really thought much about that. I tried to be a good parent to my kids, tried to be patriotic, and I just hadn't really thought much about that. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure everyone will think of you as a good husband, a good father, and a great doctor.
I guess.
Thank you so much for all your time, sir.
Okay.
God bless you, and I just really appreciate you doing this. Could you tell us about that photo, please?
Well, that was after the war. We were staying in Fürth, Germany, and I got a military driver's license so that I could drive a Jeep, and I drove for some friends of mine. I think there was 4 of us, and we took a little vacation trip down into southern Germany, and I was able to drive on the Autobahn, but I couldn't drive very fast at that time because the bridges were all blown out. But that's my experience with a Jeep.
Wow. That's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have the uniform? Your Eisenhower?
Yeah, but I can't get in it.
I bet you can now.
I might, I don't know.
Is it in here?
Up for a sec for me, please. So can you tell us, what are we looking at?
Okay. This is the 1st Division identification I had on here. This is my discharge from the Army thing.
You just have to put it up a little higher.
My discharge from the Army. This is U.S., it stands for United States. This is Crossed Rifles, that stands for the infantry. This is the 3rd Army, that was Patton's Army. And this was my discharge, what was called a Tech 4, Technician 4.
Just a little higher, yeah.
Yeah, okay. This is the Combat Infantry Badge.
And many of the veterans I meet, they say that's the most important one. Why is that?
Well, I guess it shows you are actually in combat, and
a man.
I guess that's it, yeah.
And then what about those stripes at the bottom, sir?
Where's that? Oh, this is my 3 years overseas, or 6 months.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But this is the original Eisenhower jacket?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, they were really prized possessions, and they were really nice and warm, nice to wear.
Yeah, they're sharp.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're bringing that back. Did you guys, in the new army.
Oh, are they?
It-
That'll be
they're-
great.
They're bringing it back. They call it the pinks and the greens.
Okay.
I think is what they're calling.
Okay.
Um,
I'm Claude Harwood, and I was a BAR gunner in the Company I of the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division, 1st Infantry Division.
Perfect. And where all did you fight?
Fought in central Germany and Belgium.
Perfect. God bless you, sir. Let me unhook you. Can I move that?
Okay.
That's perfect. I'm gonna do. It's called dubbing. You know, some things, as you say it, I'll be showing different pictures and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important to have. But this was very much worth the trip. Thank you guys so much for your accommodation.
Okay.
Let's start putting your house back together.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna have you hold that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I really like that. Was a great story. Can you open it up to that? What you were telling me they wrote for you? Did they
Okay.
type that or did they write that?
No, they just wrote it.
No. I'm just. Thank you.
Do you want me to say it or?
No, I just want you to show it to me, please. Yeah, I can zoom in on it. That's awesome.
Okay, this is Claude Harwood. These are my medals from World War II. This is the 1st Infantry Division patch. This is the battle medal from World War II with 3 battle stars. This is the Victory Medal. This is a Bronze Star. This is Purple Heart and Good Conduct Medal. This is the 26th Infantry Regiment Blue Spader Badge, and this is the Combat Infantry Badge.
Wow. It's an honor to meet you, sir.